Thank you very much, Antonia. When I was putting this presentation together, as Antonia said, I was lucky enough to join it was the Chartered Institute of Housing South East branch study tour to both Detroit and Ontario, Canada. They're a very proactive branch, and they do 2 study visits a year, one overseas and one within the UK. And I think they're looking at Cardiff for their next UK visit, so I may be in touch with some of you to be organising some contact there. We were in Detroit for 2 days, a very busy 2 days, but when you're sort of trying to tease out a whole sort of stuff, you realise how much you don't know rather than how much you do know. But felt very lucky to be able to go and see small parts of the city, it has to be said, and to be able to share some thoughts with you. There may well be others of you in the room who've been to Detroit and know it a lot better than I do as a visitor of only 2 days, so it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts in the discussion. I've got a presentation. It's got some clips of other video links linked in. So if you'll bear with me, I'll trundle through the whole thing. So it should be about 35-40 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time for discussion. So the question, and Richard posed it to me, he decided, gave me an easy title, Requiem or Resurrection, and we've had a few email conversations since I've been, wasn't it? Which was the end of October, beginning of November, and I'm still kind of like, I'm really not sure, but I'll explain why that is as I go through. So just a few images of the spirit of Detroit and some smart looking parts of the city. So I've put plenty of pictures in as well, rather than relying on words. So that's Detroit, downtown Detroit, looking from Windsor, Ontario, which was another part of our study tour. We had a housing focused part of the study tour in Windsor. So opposite, just over the Detroit River, quite a lot of sort of linked economic activity. Certainly lots of people who live in Windsor work in Detroit, some vice versa. And the big tall circular building is the GM headquarters. So downtown Detroit, looking quite, you look at that skyline and that view and think, all is looking healthy with that particular city. So just a recap of Detroit in numbers, because it's a very particular. We were joined at different parts of the trip by some Canadians and an American guy who works in housing in Chicago, and he was giving me a little talk in the bus one day about the Detroitness of Detroit. Why Detroit is quite particular in many ways. It is physically huge, around 139 square miles. It is flat. The land is just flat. So urban sprawl could take place without any physical boundaries. It was built for a maximum population of 2 million, which it never quite got to, but it got up to about 1.8 million, and it's now under 700,000 and still falling. If you look, there's a picture a bit later on, which was only a few years ago, and that has a population of 800 and some thousand, so it's still reducing. There's a significant issue around employment and poverty. So the median household income is less than $27,000 a year, compared for the state of Michigan to over $48,000. You've got 15% formal unemployment, and I guess informal would be a lot higher, and over a third of the population living in poverty, and that goes up to a half of those under 18. 20% of the population don't have a car, which is a bit of a challenge in a city that was built for the car and very much with the car in mind. Over 80% of the Detroit city area are African Americans, and that really contrasts with the wider Metro Detroit area, which is around 2/3 white in terms of ethnicity. And the city politics has been, if you followed it at all, has been quite interesting. I think it was either 2 or 3 mayors ago ended up in jail with a jail sentence of 28 years for some rather unscrupulous activity, shall we say. The city councillors, until a year ago, were all elected to represent the whole of the city. They didn't actually have electoral divisions. So part of the change that's going on, and the relatively recently elected Mayor Mike Duggan, they've decided now to have electoral divisions, so city councillors have a responsibility to a particular area of the city rather than all representing the whole city. The current mayor, Mike Duggan, is white. previous incumbents, at least in recent history, have been black. So there's a kind of multi-layered race and politics. The mayor of Detroit has always been a Democrat. The politics in Michigan State are Republican. So there's some interesting things going on there politically. Just to give you a sense of the size, the Detroit is the orange bit on the map. And you've got San Francisco, Boston and Manhattan put in that same areas. And you see the Detroit population there is nearly 850,000 because this was in 2009. So the population shrunk by another 150,000 odd since then. So you've got, if you add up the population of Boston, Manhattan and San Francisco, you've got a population of over 3 million, and yet that's in a smaller physical area than Detroit, that now has a population of under 700,000. So it is very, very low density. We were in an area of the city called Mexican Town, which was described to us as a dense part of the city, and you're kind of looking around thinking, wow, it's in terms of the UK cities, it's really, really low density. And I suppose one of the issues in terms of could it happen here is that very specific geography. We haven't got we have some urban sprawl, but we don't have, you know, in terms of and we have a green belt policy, which I know, you know, there's been all sorts of debate about that recently, but there's just been no green belt policy in Detroit. So the way that the population moved out from the centre to increasingly suburban areas, question mark, could that happen in the same way in the UK? Don't know, but just pose that as a question. So in terms of where the city is currently, so we have a problem or two. The depopulation has taken place in a number of phases. There was first, probably familiar with the term white flight. So when the city's main forms of employment started collapsing and the city became certainly the central parts of the city became a less pleasant environment to live in. And one of the things actually that got talked a lot about as a major issue during our visit was education and poor education causing first white flight, but then black middle class to move out to where they and their children would have a better deal. And a very interesting sort of contrast between Canada and the States. Canada's as far as I got to know it, seems far more in public policy and structural like the UK, or more European than the States. And the Canadians were saying, well, we just wouldn't have that differential in quality of education between the best school and the poorest school that would play out in the same way as it has in Detroit. I'm just going to test the old links now. Just going to the dereliction of houses that has resulted from this depopulation is known as the lovely term blight. So I'm just going to play a little clip of this is sort of residential blight. It's rather serene music to go with something that isn't serene at all. And if you look, all of these streets have empty patches between them, and they used on every sort of lot there used to be a house. And so some lots now are totally empty, some have derelict houses on. Some of these houses will be occupied, very few of them, but some of them will. And so those empty lots, they would have all, and they would not only have been houses on this side, they would have been back to back between each street as well. And there's just a massive amount of properties that have been burnt out. Just turn the music down a bit. And one of the reasons why, or a major reason why the properties get burnt out is it's much easier to strip the metal out of the properties. Once they've been burnt, you can get at the metal, whether it's from wiring and other sources, so to get some scrap value. But it's quite, we drove around one afternoon around East Detroit, and it's very difficult to describe. It is really quite shocking. It is sort of like there's been some kind of, you know, chemical disaster or something. It's really hard to comprehend that these used to be perfectly normal, fully occupied streets with people in employment and decently maintained, etc. I'll come on to talk about the numbers in a bit, but you get the idea. And it's not all over the city, but particular neighbourhoods have had a massive depopulation. And then in terms of non-residential, this is just a quick. Oh, that one's not going to work. The central train station is a. I've got a photo of it later, I think. Is probably a 25 story building, which is really, really visible from many areas of the city and from across the water in Windsor. And it is totally derelict. It's a fantastic architectural building, but it's just standing there in a kind of glorious dereliction, as it were. And the blight has affected as much commercial and non-residential property as it has residential. So even downtown, which you've got very smart office buildings like the GM headquarters, you've got tower blocks that are empty, you've got office buildings that are empty, and just this feeling of abandonment. The urban sprawl, this sort of no green belt, the 139 square miles, there's an estimate that for every square mile of residential area, that it costs the city $9 million per year to provide basic services to. So you've got, in terms of maintaining, in terms of waste collection, in terms of emergency services, etc. So you've got this challenge of service provision, and as people have left, no tax base. So you've got whole square miles where I think the estimate is it would be about $360 million to provide services to areas that are not generating much tax base for the city at all. So that comes on to the money, really. So as well as people moving out of the city, so there's less people around to pay their property taxes. At the moment, and this is a really shocking fact, less than half of Detroit property owners are actually paying the property taxes that they owe. All sorts of reasons for that. The city's historically been quite lax in its collection, and there's a really interesting and struck me as totally balmy policy around foreclosure. So if you don't pay your property taxes for 3 years, the city takes over your house. So you lose your home, and the city then owns it, but the city doesn't have any structures to manage and maintain property. So the city's ended up owning masses of homes across and masses of land that's gone with those homes, and it has no real, well, A, it has no money to do anything with them, and B, it has no proper structures in terms of staffing or skills. And not only that, but the interest rate, I was just looking at this stuff this morning, the interest rate on, so if you don't pay your property tax 1 year, it's 18% interest gets added on, and then the next year that you don't pay as well. So you've just got this massive ratcheting up of debt around property taxes. And I think it's something like $706 million of unpaid property tax that really there's not much chance of getting back. And given the low average incomes, there's the next set of homeowners who are likely to be in that position in the coming years. But it seems like one of those sort of unbudgeables, although one of the plans I'll talk about in a minute actually did recommend changing that policy. And the tax base, the sort of valuation for property taxes hasn't been reassessed in the last 40 years. Whether that would take you back to about where it was 40 years ago, who knows, or whether actually the properties are worth even less. But there's a massive issue, and you may well be aware the city's was actually declared as bankrupt, and just at the tail end of while we were in Canada, actually, the judge agreed the plan for Detroit to exit bankruptcy. So there is a plan which I'll say a bit more about in a minute. That's the Central Station building. So it's an absolutely fantastic, beautiful building. But as you can see, it's just this. It's been gutted. It's just it's totally derelict. That's a bit fuzzy. That's the Packard plant, which is one of the largest industrial buildings that's derelict, I think, anywhere on the planet. Huge automotive plant, which is totally abandoned. And then even this is in Midtown Detroit, where there's been redevelopment work going on, and this lovely community garden. Even there, as you can see in the background, there's buildings that are very, very visible buildings that are derelict. And this was the most extraordinary thing. Detroit on the east side backs on to Grosse Pointe City, which is a very affluent suburb of Detroit. That's actually, that barn is across the main road between Detroit and Grosse Pointe. You can still drive around, you just have to go around in a bit of a loop. So, and then it's the most visible thing about, you know, the difference between poverty and dereliction and affluence. On the one side, that's looking back towards Detroit. You've got blight, you've got uncared for open space. You know, just it looks poor and uncared for. And that's like 10 yards the other way, looking in the other direction, with Grosse Pointe with a tax base and this rather nice little street with lots of cafes and nice places to take your kids, and etc., etc. And even the road surfaces, you can see, are so much better. And Grosse Pointe Council, they just built the barn across the road because their rationale was they wanted a safe place to set up a farmer's market. There are other views about what it was about, but that was the most. It was just so visible that there are such different lives that people are leading. And I suppose that when we were driving around the areas with such amount of blight, I was just trying to imagine what it'd be like to live there. You know, you might have in your little block, you know, 4 or 5 really derelict houses. One of them might have been burnt out, another one might have squatters in. You might have 2 other occupied houses, and then all this uncared for land, etc. And just the feeling of lack of safety and lack of hope, and of course no shops or anything, because there's not enough people to keep a base of in terms of keeping businesses going. So so there's major issues for Detroit. So there's quite a lot of plans around to that have a different vision for Detroit and sort of find a new purpose for the city. So the first one is something called Detroit Future City, and they've got a very good website. This is their summary plan, and they carried out, a big team carried out a very participatory process. There had been previous plans for Detroit that hadn't really engaged with communities, that hadn't really gone anywhere, and it's actually it's very ambitious. It's a 50-year vision, particularly around future land use, focusing on how you turn the liability of vacant land, which the city hasn't got the money to maintain, into an asset. And so it looks at 5 different elements. It looks at economic growth, the need for you know, decent jobs, land use in and of itself, city systems, so in particular transport, you know, taking into account 20% of the city's population at the moment doesn't have a car, neighbourhoods, which are really strong in the city, and land and buildings. And it's worth, if you're interested, it's worth having a look at the website, because they actually come up with a rational land use plan for the city, and talk about different phases of getting there. So the next 5 years they talk about as a sort of stabilisation phase, and then moving on to the more ambitious. And the really interesting thing is it's not about trying to get the city back up to 1.8 million population. There's an issue about stabilising the population and not having any more population loss, but it's about how you make use of that land. So there's a lot of focus on green and blue infrastructure, so open space, so urban farming. Stormwater management is a particular issue for the city. When it rains a lot, flat, lots of water, and it's not always just water, ends up where it shouldn't. And also energy generation. So there's a really comprehensive look at how that vast area can be used in a much more focused way, and very clear identification of areas of the city for certain uses. So in terms of different types of employment, etc. So very comprehensive vision, which a lot of both community members and organisations and entrepreneurs and third sector organisations, not-for-profit organisations, private sector businesses, etc., are involved in developing. The plan doesn't have any legal status, I suppose that's where the politics of the thing comes in. I think the current mayor would like it to, by the end of his term, to have a legal status, and then it has some possibility of then being carried on, because it's not the things are not going to get sorted in 5 years. The mayor, when he came in order to get elected, had his own 10-point plan which again focused around every neighbourhood having a future. The future not being Blight, but not necessarily being a residential neighbourhood. So some very consistent themes between those two things. But one of the things he's done is to create a department of neighbourhoods within the city council, because before the probably 8, 9, 10 different departments that were dealing with neighbourhoods in different ways. So that's got a much greater role in coordinating things. As I said, that was a political plan. And then we come to the Blight Removal Task Force, which is a really interesting document, very hefty document. Sits within the context of Detroit Future City Plan and the Mayor's Plan, but is really practical. I'll talk about the mapping exercise that they did in a minute, but really practical in terms of how blight can be removed. And one of the big things is coordination between agencies. There's a lot, as in any city that size, there's a lot of organisations doing a lot of things. And there's still a question in my mind about how coordinated things are. And looking at aligning funding opportunities and changing those approaches that are clearly not working, the property tax foreclosure policy that I mentioned earlier. So to me, that policy almost seems like a way of the city not collecting the taxes that it's owed. And there's also a plan associated now with the City Authority exiting bankruptcy, and that's got a 10-year time frame. So you can see there's all sort of slightly different things going on, and that's mainly around the stabilisation of finances. So a couple of bits of detail of that. It allows the city to take 7 billion of unsecured liabilities from its total debt of 18 billion. And some of the ways it's doing that is pensions are being cut. So for people who've worked for the City Authority, there's a reduction in healthcare benefits of 90% for all retirees. Bondholders have accepted big losses, and there was a real concern about the Detroit Institute of Art and whether that would have to be sold as part of the exiting bankruptcy plan. But a combination of foundations, private donors, and the state of Michigan have raised collectively just over 800 million to protect that asset, so that can remain in city ownership. And the adjustment plan, as it's called, that's approved by the judge, has set aside 1.7 billion over the next 9-10 years for investment in basic services and infrastructure, and that includes blight removal. $1.7 billion sounds like a lot of money, but there's, in the blight removal task force, they reckon a fairly conservative estimate, around 850 million is needed just to sort out blight. So, some people are saying actually that 1.7 billion is not going to last 10 years, 9-10 years. It could be spent within a 5-year period. So there's the judge is sort of doing the final bits of that, judging whether the city can come out of bankruptcy, and then once the final decision's been made, which is due in the next couple of weeks, government powers will then be returned to Detroit's elected officials, because they've had a city manager rather than the power being with elected officials, and they're still going to be under the oversight of a financial review commission to make sure that the city's on track. So those are all a sort of set of plans at the city level, and then a number of areas of the city we visited have their neighbourhood or community plans as well, usually shorter term with very specific objectives. And again, we talking amongst the group was saying, do these things all match up? Or actually, when it comes down to it, if there's some funding available, do you go at a local level, a community or neighbourhood level, for expediency to get something done, as opposed to trying to make it all in line with the longer term vision? So just a few images. Blight Removal Task Force involved a whole range of organisations, private, foundations, etc. So some really positive things. Part of the Blight Removal Task Force, or what sat under the plan, was an initiative called Motor City Mapping, because everyone knew there was a lot of blight, but they weren't quite sure how much, where it was concentrated, etc. So I hope this link works, because this is really interesting. Yep, so there's a little link now about what the Motor City Mapping Initiative actually involved.
The Skillman Foundation is really interested in blight because we believe that it is an impediment to neighborhood revitalization, and it is a critical factor to the lack of safety that children face every day as they walk to and from school.
Nobody had any idea how much blight there was in Detroit. You hear numbers from 60,000 to 80,000 to 100,000 blighted properties. No one quite understood what the actual amount was.
Property is a gateway to the property taxes that fund or don't fund city services. Unpaid property taxes lead to tax foreclosure, which lead to vacant houses, which lead to blight, which lead to arsons, which lead to all these terrible things that dot the landscape of the city.
What we wanted to do was pilot a small innovation in one neighborhood and see if that innovation would have legs and it would have power.
It really started at a coffee shop. We went and sat down with Data Driven Detroit and Loveland, and I said that I needed the two of them to work together in order to do a parcel survey in Brightmoor, and asked them to come back with a joint proposal of what that would look like. And 2 weeks later, they had that proposal in front of me to basically do, incorporate neighborhood residents in parcel surveying Brightmoor.
Chris Ewell over at Skillman has been fantastic. Of all the actors and parties from foundations and potential funders for these projects, he's one of the quickest to get the impact of things and one of the quickest to really help put the resources together.
We initially used grant capital to help them in effect do research and development. As we were doing the work in Brightmoor, trying to figure out how to take down houses and also trying to figure out how to map and create this system, this is when the White House formed the Blight Task Force that was chaired by Dan Gilbert and two co-chairs, and injected $150 million into the blight removal efforts within the city.
So we are surveying every property in the city of Detroit, everything including residential, commercial, industrial, and vacant land. At the same time as doing this massive survey, Data Driven Detroit is also assembling 14 different administrative data sets from multiple sources, city, county, state, and federal sources, and combining all of those and making these things talk to one another.
Technology we built for the survey is an app called Blexting, short for blight texting. Surveyors come in the morning, they check out a Google Nexus 7 tablet, they open up the app, and they see a map of the city with where they are, and tap the property they're standing next to. It opens up the camera, they take a picture of the property they're looking at, and then it asks them a series of questions about that property. Is there a structure here, or is it a lot? And then depending on which one they pick, it forks and it asks them more questions. And as soon as they press send on that, that immediately goes back to the Mission Control Lab where we're at, where we watch all of that come in real time.
We actually wouldn't have been able to do this current project without having tested the waters a little bit on that first smaller neighborhood. So we piloted basically the entire program that we're using here and now.
Our second investment came being a part of the Blight Task Force. There was, for this Motor City Mapping project, there was a dollar cost for it. Us and our other partners on the task force funded that. So using this data that we gleaned from the parcel survey, we'll be able to actually stage the citywide blight removal, starting in geographic zones, and be able to phase it over the course of the next 3 years or 5 years or whatever it may be.
I think that we have to take down the blight because we can see from our experiences in Brightmoor alone that when you do something as simple as remove the blight, remove the trash out of a community, how it restores hope, how it just generates this positivity and this audacity that neighborhoods actually can make a difference and that they can come back. And I think Brightmoor is a great example. I'm starting to call Brightmoor the little neighborhood that could.
Within the Brightmoor pilot area that we've done the blight removal, where we removed now almost 300,000 pounds of waste, we are changing felt safety. We've actually, though, seen a downturn in the actual crime in that area. We quite literally have folks from all over the country calling Loveland and calling Data Driven Detroit and trying to figure out how they can do this similar process nationwide. We now have the opportunity to make an investment into the company to help them with that growth.
Detroiters are fighters. and they're resilient. And I think whenever you count them down, they always pop back up, right? And so I think about that oftentimes, that when we say that Detroiters can't do something, that's usually when they do. And so I think that as people around the world say to us that the blight problem is too big, or Detroit can't come back because of its economic issues, I think that just fuels our fire to make a difference and to prove them wrong. And it doesn't matter how we get to the positive solution as long as we get there. And I think that blight is one of the first steps in doing so.
So it's quite an extraordinary thing. They had 150 people employed for 6 to 8 weeks to map every structure and lot in the city. So over 375,000 properties and lots. And so there's this basic information now available, publicly available now via the web, updatable via the Blexting, the software that they developed, that generates maps at a neighbourhood community level, so you can see whether there's structures on land, whether if the structures are there, what condition they're in, and some information. So in terms of anybody from the city authority through to a local community organisation wondering what to do and where to start, it was a massive step forwards. Cost about £1 million, the whole exercise, funded from a number of foundations, the city and other sources. So that mapping exercise found that there were nearly 85,000 properties, mostly properties, about 7,000 just parcels of land, but nearly 85,000 properties and lots that met the task force definition of blight. So that's, that is really, really significant. And as they said in the clip, that the data from the Blexting was mapped alongside a range of other data sets, the data sets from the fire department, from police, from the city council, in terms of enforcement, etc. There was a sense before this took place that there was an information crisis. People knew there was a lot of blight around, but didn't know, as I say, didn't know where it was concentrated and exactly what was happening. So, and it's an ongoing process. It now can actually, people can update. So whilst they had this very concentrated exercise to map the city first off, now people can be involved in updating that information. So as demolition is taking place, which it is fairly slowly, then that information can be updated. The Detroit Land Bank Authority, which has been around for some time, has been sort of reinvigorated, both politically in terms of focus from the mayor, but also by the mapping exercise. It's a quasi-public entity, and so now it's really focusing on stabilising and strengthening the strongest neighbourhoods, those that have identified that haven't gone over the tipping point yet. And so it has a role in some demolition, in land assembly, in what they call nuisance abatement. So if a property owner's not in residence, they're given 3 options: either rehabilitate your property and occupy it within 6 months, donate your property to the Detroit Land Bank, or demolish it. And if the property owner doesn't do any of those, the Detroit Land Bank Authority has the powers to take the property owner to court, and for the title to be transferred to the Detroit Land Bank. And then they have started up a system of auctioning properties. Currently they're doing 2 a day, which if you think about the scale of things is quite slow, but they're at a starting point with that. So the properties are auctioned, usually it's a pretty low price, but they come with information about how much, the kind of work that's needed to do to refurbish them and how much money that's going to cost. And they're working with 2 different financial institutions to give the purchasers options in terms of borrowing that money. And in some cases, part of that comes as a grant, because even once the properties are done up, the value is still really low. There's a sort of gap between how much they cost to buy and do up and how much they're actually worth. So the Detroit Land Bank Authority has increased its staff team a lot, and the marketing they do is really interesting. They market the neighbourhoods as great places to live, and it made me think about some of the ways we talk about when we're talking about places to live, and perhaps marketing houses in what might be called harder to let areas. But yeah, it's very much focused on the people and the attributes of the neighbourhood rather than necessarily the house. Detroit Future City has an implementation team. There's only 12 of them, which for a 50-year ambitious plan is quite small. But what they're doing is what they're calling catalytic action through pilots. So they're using pilot and demonstration projects to prove cases that then can be implemented elsewhere. So one example is they're testing out different green infrastructure, types of green infrastructure to identify the return on investment from a community perspective, from an environmental perspective, and an economic perspective, so that then things can be rolled out more widely. So we, on the east side of Detroit, we were driving down one of the roads, and there were speedwell plantings on the side of the road. So rather than unmaintained areas, they were growing crops which actually had a role in helping decontaminate the soil, because there's quite a lot of issues around contaminated soil. You've got quite a lot of alternative uses for land and buildings emerging, and that have been around for a while. The Heidelberg project, we didn't go and see, but people may have heard of, which is a small area of the city which has been turned into a sort of art form, so that the derelict buildings are actually used as a kind of canvas for artwork. So you've got, some of them are painted, some of them have toys on them, all sorts of creative things going on. The thing we did go and see was an initiative by a private company called Hans Farms. I'm going to hope a link will work here. And this is on the east side of Detroit. This is just a couple of
We had no idea the response was going to be as big as it was.
Hans Woodlands is transforming 150 acres of Detroit's east side into 15,000 hardwood trees.
We are in charge of our destiny. We are taking control. We're making our environment better, and we're going to be able to make a better life here.
Today is a great example of working together with John and his crew and many others from around the Detroit metro area to start to redevelop the area. I think in a way that gives everybody some hope about the future.
Hans Woodlands was planned with residents in mind, striving to create a beautiful, livable neighborhood in Detroit where people want to live, work, and play.
And if not, maybe today's that start of a new fabric of community in this area that, you know, we sort of took our destiny in our own hands together, and we're making it happen.
This project was always about figuring out a way to provide a new vision for what's possible in Detroit's neighborhoods.
Just about 1,400 people showed up to help us plant trees, which is insane.
So Hans Farms, the proprietor of Hans Farms, lives in Detroit and was observing what was happening to the city, and so and very aware of the cost to the city council of maintaining this land and these properties that they now owned. So went to the city council and said, we're going to buy a square mile. We'd like to buy a square mile of land in East Detroit for cash. So something that the city council didn't have much of, and then they would take on the responsibility for maintaining that land, and their initial proposition was they wanted to do urban farming. They actually wanted to grow fruit and vegetables, but the local community, those residents who were still living in the area, were not keen on growing food because they were worried about rodents, etc. So they ended up deciding together to plant hardwood trees which can generate an income. So they now maintain the areas, the rows of trees. They have clover planted under them, both for nutrition for the trees, but also that clover doesn't need cutting as much as grass does. So that's quite a canny way of doing things. And then Hans Farms, working with neighbourhood volunteers, they've cleared the brush. They took something like, just in a small area, they found 450 tyres that had been dumped and masses of household waste, etc. So they've cleaned up the area. They also agreed as part of the deal with the City Council to remove, I think it was 50 blighted homes, and just even the trees are quite small at the moment. But in terms of the difference of the look of the area, because the land is being taken care of, is tremendous, and they're very ambitious. They want to do a lot more of it, but obviously in conjunction with communities. There's local redevelopment in different parts of the city. We saw an area called the Woodward Corridor, where there's been redevelopments of office buildings, of other businesses, of mixed-use developments. So there's a picture in a minute of a development with retail downstairs and apartments upstairs, because there's a real desire to get people living back in the city. And there's an initiative called Tech Town, which is about supporting technological business startups, and there's a sort of critical mass in a location, critical mass of businesses together, and support agencies to do that. There's some of the neighbourhoods are sort of defining or redefining themselves. We went to Mexican town, and there's quite a range of Mexican restaurants and food outlets there, and there's a desire there to build up the scale of Mexican town so it can attract private investment and also attract people to come to Detroit, to Mexican town for an evening to go as a destination to go out. And there's a whole pile of, what really struck me, of entrepreneurs, philanthropists. I mean, every initiative we looked at, there were multiple charitable foundations had put masses of money in. There's not-for-profit, there's profit with purpose, as some of the organisations call themselves. They're engaged and investing in the city. There's an organisation called, a profit with purpose housing organisation called Southwest Housing Solutions, which again was trying to get affordable housing back in the city, and had done a project specifically for homeless veterans. And they were really clear, their focus: if the market's working okay, we don't need to be there. If it's not functioning normally, we need to be there and engaging. So just some pictures. So this was the Motor City mapping. So the underlying issue being you can't solve a problem if you don't understand it. That's the current situation around tax foreclosure. So yeah, the $709 million owed in overdue taxes and penalties. So you've got nearly 60,000, well, this phrasing's great, isn't it? Tax distressed and delinquent properties, and then another 100,000 possibly eligible for foreclosure. So it's just mind-boggling. The shipwreck, as someone used the phrase. So you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. You know that this sort of system's created, and around 24,000 properties at auction. That's the kind of mapping that the Motor City mapping produced, and each of these little rectangles is an individual plot. So I mean, it's hyper detailed and incredibly useful data for all agencies. That's a picture of the Heidelberg project, and you can see the on the left there the house being used as a canvas for artwork. But it's now the Heidelberg project actually attracts a lot of visitors that come in, and there are sort of art events there. That's the Woodward Corridor development that I was talking about with commercial outlets downstairs, and then the first and second stories there are apartments. Again, there's a funding gap on this because the rental, the sort of level that the market will support on rent is less than the costs to build or refurbish properties. So kind of constantly chasing money to fill that investment gap, we had lunch in this place. You can see really, really high quality refurbishment of buildings. So part of Woodward Avenue now has got lots of nice sort of office blocks and nice places to eat and bars and things. That's Mexican Town, and that was the area that was referred to by our hosts as this is one of the denser areas of the city, and you can see how wide the roads are and how you know, in our terms it looks very low density. Okay, just the last couple of slides now. Some really positive indicators, I think, even in sort of commercial terms, pure economic terms, if you like. Commercial banks are now investing in the city, whereas a number of years they wouldn't have looked at it. So there is a sense of increasing economic confidence. Private sector companies are locating in the city or are investing in existing infrastructure they've got. There's been an increase in construction activity. Some private investors have taken on large numbers of vacant buildings downtown. There's a organisation called Quicken Loans, which I guess probably has something in common with Pounds to Pocket and that kind of thing. But Dan Gilbert of Quicken Loans is a Detroiter and is doing a lot in terms of taking on those vacant buildings and finding a purpose for them. And there are also a lot of new startup businesses. It's attractive in the sense that costs are really low, you know, low rent or low purchase price for property, and there's lots of support available for companies. So just lastly, my reflections really. I suppose the important, the Detroitness of Detroit, if you like. The geography seems to be a real key issue. The scale of the city, the flatness of the land, the lack of a green belt policy, so that the urban sprawl, but also the role of neighbourhoods and the really distinct identity of neighbourhoods. So in a way, it's not just about Detroit finding an identity for Detroit, it's about neighbourhoods finding an identity for neighbourhoods, and that's something that the Detroit Future Cities is really strong on. So there is a future for every neighbourhood. It's not necessarily the one that it's not looking back, it's looking forward to a different future. The people side of things, it was quite extraordinary really. The issue of race hardly got mentioned at all, and you're aware that you're in a city that's 85% African American, and most of the people we met in most of the organisations that we went to were white. There were 2 black women at senior level in the Detroit Land Bank Authority, but that was the only company. And so there was this really, and even walking around parts of the city, apart from when we were in East Detroit, it was quite a strange, really quite a strange thing. And one of our group who works in housing in Hackney kept on asking about community cohesion and kept trying to ask the question, and it just wasn't coming through as a strong issue. So whether it's not an issue because the city's predominantly black, I don't buy that. But and obviously 2 days is absolutely not enough time to get a proper sense of that. But it's it's definitely an issue, and absolutely an issue in terms of poverty. Is it, class issue? Middle class people, black and white, have moved out of the city, and there's an employment skills issue. So you've got a lot of people who work in Detroit, in downtown Detroit, as employment's increasing, are coming from outside of Detroit each day, are commuting, and are not necessarily Detroiters. So, there's a mismatch, it feels, between the current population and the sort of employment opportunities that are emerging. The politics of the thing, it's interesting. You have a view, don't you, of America and free market economics and stuff. Boy, oh boy, there's a lot of government around. So there's federal government, the state government, the city government, the county, and then even within Detroit, there's actually 2 bits of Detroit that are under different, Highland Park and Hamtramck, that are under different administrations again. And so you've got, and as I say, Detroit's Democrat, Michigan's Republican, so you've got constantly sort of possibility for political kind of tetchiness, as well as the personality thing and political cycles, and political cycles are very short when you've got, a 50-year vision to transform the city to a new future. And the complexity, you know, the City Council, well, particularly in the last couple of years, while the bankruptcy thing's being, and I mean, they just haven't had teams of people you would expect to have in a city that size. They haven't been taking on the coordination role. What the guy from the housing organisation we saw just says you know, we haven't got a partnership with the City Council because the partnership chair's been empty. There just haven't been the people there with the either there at all or with the skills to do what's needed. Obviously, that's a whole, as part of the exiting bankruptcy plan, that's a whole kind of other element of the work that needs to be undertaken. And the contrariness of different instruments, this thing about, you know, well, the foreclosure policy particularly, you know, that just seems to be undermining and actually creating more foreclosure and more people leaving the city because they can't afford to pay their property taxes. A lot of different sources of money coming into the system, particularly strong community development finance institution in the area, and oodles of money from foundations, you know. So it sort of strikes me as quite ironic, really. You know, you've seen the financial sector cause a massive issue and contribute massively to this, to what's happened in Detroit, obviously, as well as the collapse of the automotive industry there. But you know, the financial sector has has had some role to play, and then there's foundations set up by, you know, JP Morgan and others are funding now this sort of some of the activity that's going on now. But also I have to say, you know, so I'm still really, really conflicted. Do I think Resurrection or Requiem? I think there's masses of positive stuff going on, and you can't help but be struck by the passion, commitment and entrepreneurship of the people in many of the organisations that we saw, you know, and that commitment to Detroit. They're Detroiters, they want to see their city you know, be in a better place than it has been for the last number of years. But there's this little thing of me just thinking, I'm worried about the politics of the thing, and just whether the politics of the thing will allow the necessary time frame to roll on without someone else jumping in and saying, oh, actually what we need in Detroit is something else entirely, and things scooting off in a different direction. So I'm not going to answer Rich's question. I don't know whether it's going to be. I think some parts of the city will improve. Whether the city as a whole will manage to transform itself in the way that there is a really clear vision for, and I think it's a really well evidenced and it's not one that's about looking backwards and how do we get another million people to come into the city. It's about how can a city of this size make more sense. You know, the vision is really well crafted, but it's, you know, it's a huge implementation task. So we'll have to see. It's just a. That's it. Yep.
Oh, thank you very much.
I'm very interested in the contrast between the deep place work that's been done by Dave Adamson and Mark Lang and Tredegar and this here. And it worries me that there's a disconnect in a way that the deep place studies identified, that is the real needs of the people, because what we see here is an emphasis on economic growth. And there's probably, given the American context, and even though there's lots of government around, as you said, there's probably an emphasis on trickle-down economics or something like that, that somehow is going to produce goods for the people at the bottom of the tree. Now, we know that doesn't work in Blaenau Gwent, or even in London for that matter, with 31% of children living in poverty in both places. So it seems to me that there's a commitment to a model which doesn't work. And that may well be why the plan in Detroit eventually fails. I hope it doesn't, because that spirit of entrepreneurship would be very welcome in Blaenau Gwent, I'm sure. And I just wonder whether you think that there's some scope for a blending of these two approaches that obviously we can learn from both, but somehow the economic model, I think, is going to stand in the way both of Glenelg and Detroit. Do you have any thoughts about that?
That's really, really interesting point. And you're right, because the economic growth issue is one for the city as a whole. You know, and so yes, we want more jobs in Detroit, but whether there's this huge skills gap, whether therefore for the be accessible by the folk that are living in poverty in Detroit now, massive question mark. And so the foundational economy thing's really interesting. We saw in East Detroit, it was a community regeneration organisation. Spent a little bit of time, a little bit of a bus tour with them. And the woman said it had taken them 12 years to get a little strip mall on the corner of the main road, which had basic things like a supermarket and a drugstore and a garage. And that had taken 12 years. You know, so I don't even know where you'd start with the foundational economy in some bits of the city, because it's just not there. So I'm not saying you shouldn't, but it would need. I think you'd have to start in a slightly different, because there's no investment in housing, because the city owns stuff, but it's not doing anything with it. Although in some neighbourhoods, hopefully that will be changing as people are buying and investing in the homes. There's not even basic services like street lighting or waste collection have been happening. So I absolutely understand your point, but I just.
Why did you say that people were interested in growing food?
They didn't. It was interesting. The Hans Farms bought this square mile, and there was quite a lot of controversy about them buying the land. And they wanted to work with the community to grow food, but they were worried about. I mean, I suppose it's their experience of what has been a very unsafe neighbourhood for the last number of years. They were worried about vermin and people stealing it, and so trees was where it landed, which can still be a good resource. They can generate an income, they can have an educational purpose, they can help the place look a whole heap better. But it just seemed we were kind of quite taken aback by that you wouldn't.
Do people in the supermarket down at the strip,
or could they grow? Yeah. But that was the community voice coming through there. I mean, maybe that would change in when there was more maybe more trust between the agencies, and because I guess people just feel they've, in those very blighted areas of the city, they've just been abandoned and let life doesn't have any kind of safe structures that we would be used to seeing, and that's why it was so hard imagining what it would be like to actually live in one of those neighbourhoods. Yeah, but I agree. The two are needed.
Actually, there are some papers and websites now showing food growing. Micro-urban farming is taking off in other bits. Obviously, it's massive. Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily, but I've been looking at some of that. My question was very closely related because when we looked at the film, if you remember, one of the things we commented on at the end was the percentage of adults with innumeracy and illiteracy rates, and that if the residual population was hoping for new investment to create jobs, then maybe, although we are talking America, I realise it's a different scenario, but you talked about differentials in the educational investment for young people. Did you come across any investment in adult education, informal or formal?
Education didn't feature heavily in the organisation. Say we only had 2 days in terms of our visits, but it didn't. Having been mentioned as one of the reasons why you had the movement out of the city by many people, because they just weren't prepared to tolerate the low quality of education for youngsters. There's, in terms of the sort of economic growth element, it does talk about, a city of, as well as a city of robust job growth, a city of equitable growth. But in terms of, we didn't hear about a lot of skills. And as I say, there is this. I do worry that the jobs that are created will be more people. So they'll be increasing the need for better transport infrastructure, and not meeting the needs of folk who are who've been left in that third of the city. So 250,000 people living in poverty. How's it going to change? Because trickle down never did it? So how are things going to change for them? Even downtown might be looking better, midtown might be looking better. There might be a nice, I don't know, sort of employment district on the west side. But what about those areas that are? And actually, when you look at this, I suppose fundamentally it's about changing the use of those neighbourhoods altogether to be more open space, more environmentally kind of focused areas for energy generation, etc. But yeah, it was a missing link really in terms of so how does that link in that third of the population?
Are you going to make
Yeah, thanks, Tamsin. I mean, that was fascinating. Can I come back to some of the issues around the sort of the politics and the strategic planning and the links between sort of the metropolitan area and the wider suburban area? I mean, clearly American cities, like British cities, have had the opportunity for major suburban growth, and people have said it's been sort of a reverse musical chairs, really. You can keep building in the suburbs, and in some senses that will add to the exodus from the cities. And I wondered if, you weren't there very long, but whether you had any feeling that there was a strategic discussion between the city and the policies.
Well, you saw how strategic it got between Grosse Pointe and Detroit.
It was
with the barn
almost
across
sort of Cottesloe walls or whatever,
the barn across the road.
Building a barrier between the city and the suburb.
And one of the questions that one of our group asked was, why, would it be absolutely impossible to countenance changing the actual city boundary of Detroit, so you bring in some of those wealthier suburbs then, so because you've got this constant issue about where's the tax base, because even if you've got more jobs but people are commuting into the city to take up those jobs, they're not contributing to the property tax base that then gives the city enough money to do what it needs to do. So it's this iterative. But I mean that question went down like an absolute. As I spoke, we'll look at local government reorganisation here. It's similar. So that's why I was saying the politics of the thing. I just think have got an opportunity to scupper, whether it's short-termism or neighbouring. I think. For growth, I mean, I found it just really profoundly shocking standing by that barn and looking one way and seeing abject dereliction and looking the other way, and it would like a street in Cardiff or somewhere. It was, people going around, sort of a recognisable kind of urban way of living, and just to say, build the barn because then we don't have to look at it, and it seemed to be that. I mean, obviously that's only one sort of interface, if you like, on the east side of the city, but I suspect it's as fractious, if not quite so physically obvious, with other neighbouring authorities, because they want their tax base, and if it costs them less to deliver services because they've got an easier population to deliver to, well, that's kind of reasonably okay, but yeah, and the fact that the state has a different colour of politics from the city as well, and the person that's been overseeing the bankruptcy stuff was appointed by Michigan State, so that you've got the sort of political dimension there. So yeah, the two things we come up with, change the foreclosure policy and change the boundaries of Detroit, and actually you could, possibly both those things could have quite a big impact. But yeah.
Just briefly, thank you very much, Tamsin. I know sort of 2 days is quite brief, but during your time there, I was wondering whether you or what your observations were of any schemes to manage or target homelessness. You mentioned in terms of the unemployment and the majority of people, you know, the blight that was caused by people leaving, but in terms of the people that were staying, and especially in terms of the foreclosure mechanism, meaning that these properties are coming into ownership of the state, and obviously a radical idea for the United States, but was there any sort of movement? You mentioned obviously the democratic roots of the city. Was there anything in terms of social housing or anything kind of mentioned at all?
The main form of sort of low-income housing is generated by a tax credit system, so it's very different from us. So the tax credit goes to the private investor who puts the money in, basically. So it's all kind of done from that end of things. So there is a small amount of that, but I mean, across the US, it's a very small proportion. We did see the scheme specifically for homeless veterans that the Profit with Purpose, as they call themselves, housing organisation had done, and that's just 3,500 homeless veterans in Detroit. That's just veterans, you know, before you talk about any other category of folk. And I suspect, we didn't look at homelessness in any detail, but I suspect there'll be a lot of sort of informal or, you know, people squatting and people, you know, sharing 2-3 households to a house and that kind of thing. So so there isn't a great, as compared to New York, say, where there's been a huge emphasis on eradicating street or doing something about street homelessness. But again, when you wonder politically, being a bit cynical, whether that's about because New York gets a lot of visitors and it's not a nice thing to see, is it? So, and I just think the problems have been so fundamental and basic in Detroit that you know, one would hope that comes along the line. But it's, you know, street lighting, waste collection, you know, it's very basic. Although you could see a creative solution with the homes that are in the ownership of the city, actually, if they engaged with a not-for-profit provider who could manage, you know, and you could actually do something quite creative before those homes just tip into blight. But the structures and the people haven't been there to enable that to happen. There's one over there and another one there. Oh, right. Two, there's another one at the back there as well.
Thanks. Hi. I'm interested in the various ways of cleaning up and reusing the urban land and comparing with what happens in a lot of European cities. And so firstly, you mentioned that there was a lot of cleaning up of the blighted buildings and so on. Are they doing any recycling of all the demolition and construction waste? You know, is there any effort like that, as there would be in most European cities? And secondly, you mentioned the possible use of the land for energy generation. Did you see any creative renewable energy generation, like solar farms or anything like that? No, and no, actually. I mean, not to say that the energy so I think the energy generation stuff's more a vision thing than actuality. I mean, petrol in the States is $3 a gallon. You know, just kind of quite mind-boggling. You know, and so and other energy prices a lot. So I suppose and it was a city around the car as well. So but the intent is definitely to do stuff around energy generation, but it's not there in any big scale at all yet. And the recycling simply don't know. It wasn't mentioned because there would be a lot of stuff. So I think a lot of the houses have been raided for, you know, particularly where they're burnt. There's actually not much structure left other than charred wood and the plinth. You know, so there's informal recycling, but at a big structural scale, don't know.
It's a mapping question or two. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on mapping the blight, but has there been any mapping of the positive things that are happening? And also something that I was just curious about is, have they mapped where the people have gone to who've left Detroit? Presumably they left because, you know, they couldn't pay their mortgages, or has it created some sort of, you know, rural poverty somewhere else in the state? Or don't they know where they've gone to?
In terms of the mapping, the motor city mapping was every structure in the city. So good structures commercial and residential as well as blighted ones. So there's sort of colour coding on that detailed map I showed you. So there are very clear, it's very clear where there are areas where all the structures, both residential and commercial, are in good condition. And so that's part of how they sort of identified neighbourhoods that could be saved from tipping over. And so it was about they were really keen to do every structure in the city. And I think that, for me, that's what's so incredible about the process, really. That it covered everything. In terms of where people have gone, there were different waves of people moving out. So the white flight and then the black middle class flight was to surrounding. So quite a lot of them retaining an employment link in Detroit, but wanting a better quality of life, or maybe even getting work elsewhere. So there was a sort of move out to the suburbs. In terms of it's incredible, isn't it? And where if there's all this foreclosure going on, where do people go? And we didn't hear about anything that sort of tracked any of those folk, and one suspects a lot of it will be teaming up with friends, neighbours, or there's a lot of space in America. The trailer park thing, and communities can be quite invisible, really. So it certainly makes you think about where those folk they've now got no asset, they've got very little revenue because they couldn't pay their property taxes. Where do they end up, and what kind of life do they end up having? Yep. It'd make a really good research study, wouldn't it? Sort of very tricky though, trying to track people.
Hi, Tamsin. It's quite frightening to see kind of a big city like that just kind of literally just within a few years fall apart. But I mean, what comparisons are there, say, with other places in the world, like Eastern Germany, for instance, cities like Leipzig that are also falling apart, but have perhaps different responses? Are there any kind of efforts to kind of match up and learn? And secondly, I think, are the kind of conditions, this is maybe a bigger point, the conditions that America offers with indeed so much land available, so much room, and so that people actually can leave and go and start again somewhere else, exacerbating this problem, while in Europe we're probably more tight and have to stay where we are and make the most of it.
Yes, I think the second point exactly. It's such a, although the other cities in the Rust Belt have had a similar, if perhaps not quite so calamitous experience. And so you've got there's Flint, Michigan, other cities as well have had that big depopulation. And it was this, and in a way it's got a resonance with South Wales, isn't it? Because it was this reliance on one form of industry there, obviously the automotive industry here, coal and steel. So that whole thing about how you find a different purpose, a different rationale for being as an area where you were really clear what it was, and that's now gone. So that has some resonance with South Wales, but the geography is a big thing. In terms of learning from Europe, didn't hear anything about that, I have to say. It's really stark how different things, stuff that we take totally for granted in terms of where the state provides stuff in people's lives that just isn't there, and you have to keep. And there was a little informal conversation going on the second day at lunchtime, and the chap from one of the financial institutions that talked to us was saying, it came up. Collective ownership, and he went, "Oh, chuckle, well, that's communism, isn't it?" And having been the chair of a community housing mutual, I thought, well, I'm a communist then. So and that every now and again something would really biff you around the face, because it's so different. The starting point for things are so different. How transferable. Because the state would expect to intervene in a way in Europe, I would guess, in many European cities that actually only when there's such a massive crisis do the American cities end up having to do something. But it strikes me, the numbers concern. It would have been cheaper for the state to have had a more positive role on the way through, rather than having to have this massive program now to kind of rescue it.
Can I add something onto that? Did you see any evidence of kind of formalising the informal?
In
terms of squats that turn out quite positive or something, or people actually setting up things on and occupying spaces or land for positive uses.
Didn't see it. Didn't see anything, but it's absolutely not to say that it's not there.
Okay. All right. Talk yourself through. Okay. All right. Well, we've run out of time, and thanks very much for all your contributions. I think this is one of those stories that just sounds as if we need to revisit it.
And there's so many more layers of the onion to be peeled off as well. You know, you could spend 2 months there and still not kind of get it in a way. Yeah.
I'll have to come up with another question. It's got lots of R's in it. Carrying on. Well, thank you very much for coming, and can we just thank Tamsin again?
Thank you. Thank you.